Welcome to Project Scope Management, PMP Exam Certification Training. Under Project Scope Management, you as a project manager, it is important to know how and what are the steps captured in the scope of a project, which is very important, which has a direct impact to the success of a project, as well as the cost of a project and the duration of the project. So the project management, this is a subset. The project scope management is a subset of the entire project management process, and it ensures that the project includes all the work that is required and only the work that is required to complete the project successfully. So two concepts to understand. It includes the process includes that is required the project to include all the work that is required to complete the project successfully, and also only the work that is required to complete the project successfully. So you as a project manager will have to understand what is the work that is required for your project under this scope, and what is the work that is not required under this scope, to have a clear distinction between the wanted and the unwanted scope. Under PMBOK version 6, the project scope management have 5 processes, 3 in the planning process group and 2 in the monitoring and contouring process group. The process under the planning process group includes plan the scope management, which is the governing structure of the project, collecting requirements, defining scope, create WBS, and validate scope and control scope under the monitoring and controlling process group. Let's try to understand the difference between the product scope and the project scope. Product scope characterizes the functions that characterize the product or the service. That means the features and the characters of the product which is get delivered under the project is called the product scope. The project scope is somewhat different. It is the actual work that has to be performed in order to deliver the product or service. Let's try to take an example and understand this. Let's say you are in a project as a project manager to develop an electronic vehicle. So the product scope of an electronic vehicle will include all the functions and the features that is required and that is envisaged by your designers of the product. The project scope include the activities that is need to be performed in order to deliver the electronic vehicle. That might include testing, procuring the raw materials, and the communication plans, and the user acceptance testing, and dry tests, so and so forth. So the product scope is directly related to the functions that characterizes the product, and the project scope is a bit of a larger work. That is where the work that needs to be performed in order to deliver the product or the service. Again, when it comes to the project scope, the completion of a project scope is measured against the project management plan. The success of a project manager, the success of a project is again measured against the project management plan. Whether you are over on this project scope, whether you're over on the project budget, or whether you're over on the project schedule plan, or the completion of the project is measured against the project management plan, either the scope baseline or the cost baseline or the time baseline. Whereas the product scope, the completion of a product scope is measured against the product requirements. Again, coming in the previous example of creating an electronic vehicle, the product scope could include whether you have completed all the necessary functions that is required to develop the electronic vehicle. And the project scope, the completion of a project scope of developing an electronic vehicle will depend on the success that you get in reference to your project management plan, whether you have launched the electronic vehicle on time, on budget, and the required product scope is also being achieved. Let's try to understand the difference between the scope and the requirements. So coming back again, the project scope is the work performed to deliver the product and the service, and or the result at which the specified features and functions. The requirement of a product is where a condition of the capability that is required to be present in the product. So as we explained earlier, so there's a clear distinction between the project scope and the requirements. So in PMB examination, you need to understand this difference between the project scope and the requirements. As a project manager, you have to understand the project life cycle has a greater dependency on the project scope and the gathering of the requirements of the project scope. On the predictive life cycle, where the planning happens at the beginning of the project, and you devote much time at the beginning of the project for the planning process, the project deliverables are defined at the beginning of the project, and any changes to the scope are progressively managed. Any changes to the scope that you have already finalized would be done through the integrated change management control process, and the validating the scope, that the user acceptance testing for the scope will happen at the end of each phase, or at the end of each deliverable. So first, for the predictive life cycle, you do the planning, you do the scoping, and then you go for the development of the software, and then at the UAT stage you start validating the scope. The control scope will be an ongoing process. But if you are adapting to an agile project management style, or you are going to an iterative style, adaptive style, the project deliverables are developed over multiple iterations. At the beginning of the project, you will have a high-level view of the product backlogs or the product requirements, and then when you go on to at each iterative cycle, you will be decomposing the product requirements into more and more details. So the detailed scope are defined and approved at each iteration cycle when it begins, and intended to respond to high-level changes. So as you know, an agile life cycle or the iterative life cycle of project management, it will include more greater stakeholder engagements, where at each end of each iterative cycle, the stakeholders will be shown a workable prototype of the product. So the customer feedbacks are taken at the end of each iterative cycle, and the validating the scope and the control of the scope will be repeated at each iteration, where at the end of each iteration the customer will be shown a workable product, and the feedbacks and any changes will be captured at the end of each iterative cycle, and such changes will be taken forward as an input or the backlog requirements and for the next iterative cycle. The plan scope management process. is where you try to define how the project scope will be defined and how the project scope will be validated and controlled. So this will be the governing this will be the place where the project scope will be governed, and you as a project manager with your team, yet you will decide this is how you are going to gather the scope of this project that you are got involved in, and this is how you are going to validate the scope, and this is the process that you are going to adopt for controlling the scope of the project. So let's see so that how the plan scope management process works. So as in previous sessions, there are inputs for this process, and there are some tools and techniques that can be used in this process, and there can be some outputs of this process. So the project charter will be an input when you're planning the scope management, because the project charter will give you a high-level description of the scope. So always the project charter will give you the high-level description of the scope of the project, any assumptions, any constraints, any high-level risks that is involved, and even the high-level budget of the project. Other elements of the project management plan which we have not yet discussed, that is very important input for the plan scope management process will be the quality management plan, because the quality has a direct input or direct dependency or direct impact to the scope of the project. And also, as we just short while ago, as we discussed, the development approach that they are planning to adopt, whether it's a waterfall development approach or iterative development approach or agile development approach or a hybrid development approach, is an important input when you're planning the scope manager, because as we discussed, it has a direct impact on the method that they are going to capture the requirements of the project. Also, there are some environmental factors that will also be an input for this plan scope management. The organization culture and will be a major input. So you as a project manager, you will have to understand your customer's organization culture. For example, if you are assigned as a project manager to implement an ERP system to a government organization, you will have to know the culture of your customer's organization. As you know, government organizations have bureaucratic and red tapes. So if you're planning the scope, you will have to understand what are the implications that is there on the scope of the project, as well as the market conditions is also an important factor when you're planning the scope management of a project. Any policies and procedures that is already in place of your organization that specify this is how you should plan your scope, this is how you should validate your scope, and this is how you should control your scope, will be a direct input when you're designing how you're going to plan the scope of your project. And also any historical lesson learned of similar projects and any historical information will be handy in planning the scope management of a project. Let's discuss certain tools that can be used in plan scope management. Obviously, the expert judgment would be a tool that can be used here. Any previous similar projects experience could come in when you're developing the planning scope management. And any information in the industry, any information that the industry that you're operating, how the other software development companies gather scope, and what is the process that they adopt, will be a great tool in assisting in developing the plan scope management. Also, you as a project manager can have series of meetings with your sponsor and any selected key stakeholders and anybody who is responsible for your project to discuss how you are going to manage the scope of this project. Also, you could consider alternative analysis of various ways in evaluating the collected requirements. You can discuss during these meetings the various ways of collecting requirements and various ways of elaborating the project scope or the product scope, or various ways of validating the scope and controlling the scope, which will be handy in deciding how to plan the scope of this project. This is an example template of a project scope management plan. As indicated here, it will describe how the project scope will be managed, and this is how the project scope is managed, and this is how the changes of this project scope will be managed, and this is how we gather the requirements of the project. So the scope management plan is an output of this process, and as discussed, the scope management plan will describe how we intend to manage the scope of this project and how we intend to monitor and control and verify the scope of this project, and how we will do the formal acceptance of this project, and how we will deal with the change request in this project. So the scope management plan will be a governance plan used for you as a project manager that will you use as your reference point to manage the scope of your project. Also, another output of this process will be the requirement management plan. As the scope management plan, the requirement management plan will also specify how the requirements will be analyzed and how the requirements will be documented in this project, and how will the requirements will be managed in this project. And also it will describe how they will be traced, tracked and reported, and how the requirements, this is the process that we will adopt in prioritizing the requirements, and this is the process that will adapt to rationalizing the requirements, and this is the traceability structure or the traceability matrix that will be used to capture and trace each and every requirement to see whether it has gone into the product. So like the scope management plan, the requirement management plan will give you how the requirements will be analyzed, documented and managed. Join me in the next video on how to collect requirements. If you find this video interesting, please subscribe to our channel.